The election of Zohran Mamdani as mayor of New York last week struck a surprising chord with the world's media, considering he's the head of just one American city's administration. But the buzz around this young Indian origin Muslim, who is an avowed democratic socialist, is just a ripple in a much older ocean. A speaker of Gujarati, Bengali, Arabic, Hindi, Luganda, and Spanish, Mamdani is a reflection of a long forgotten Indian Muslim cosmopolitanism. The Gujarati Muslim communities he descends from once challenged the Dutch for hegemony in Indonesia, poured money into schools, hospitals, and printing presses from Japan to Arabia, and helped the British Empire consolidate its grip over Africa. To this day, that Indian Muslim history still echoes in high-end London auction houses as much as in the working-class boroughs of New York. So this column began with a pretty innocent tweet pointing out that Mamdani's multilingualism would have made him a fortune in the early modern Southeast Asian spice trade. As of writing, that tweet racked up over 1 million views and 54,000 likes, and is a pretty accurate reflection of what propelled Gujarati Muslims to international trade superstardom in the first place. In her paper Gujarat's Trade with Southeast Asia, historian Ruby Maloney describes the great port of Khambat in Gujarat as having stretched out two arms, one towards Aden and the other towards Malacca. While Banias were especially prominent in East Africa and the Persian Gulf at the time, Gujarati Muslim merchants dominated the Malacca trade, conveying relatively cheap block print textiles from manufactories in Ahmedabad deep into Southeast Asia to trade for spices. The most prominent among these merchants effectively formed dynasties which were closely linked to the Mughal court, among others, but there was also a strong aspect of caste-based collective organization which paralleled that of Hindu and Jain Gujaratis. This was pretty evident, especially in Surat, which was the most impressive port on India's west coast. Its multilingual babble included Gujarati, Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Dutch, English, and Portuguese. And while there were clear distinctions between caste and religious groups, and within their communities, Gujarati merchants, both Hindu and Muslim, could be very rigid, at the same time, in their interpersonal and business relationships, this shared Gujarati heritage encouraged cosmopolitan attitudes. Historian Javed Akhtar offers several examples in his paper The Culture of Mercantile Communities in Mughal Times. In Surat, Armenian merchants were in business with Parsis and Muslims. Vaishnavite Bhatiyas, despite a taboo against crossing the ocean, jointly owned cargo and ships with Muslims. And Akhtar even cites documentary evidence of Baniya men adopting Muslim practices such as offering dowers to their wives. Muslim and Hindu merchants also collectively represented their grievances to Mughal authorities. On one occasion in 1669, when the Qazi of Surat compelled a Vaishnavite Banya to convert to Islam, nearly 8,000 merchants of all religions emigrated to Bharuch in protest against this infringement of their privileges. Now, Gujarati Muslims quickly identified Europeans as a threat to their trade dominance in Southeast Asia. Maloney notes that Dutch East India Company records mention difficulties with these merchants who took them on through price wars and by installing their own candidates as port authorities. It seemed that there was nothing that the Dutch could do to prevent Gujarati Muslims from trading. The Sultan of Johor welcomed ships belonging to the merchant Haji Zahid Beg, who bought tin in flagrant defiance of Dutch embargoes. Other merchants, according to Maloney, hired cargo space on English ships. The spectacular wealthy merchant Abdul Ghaffar of Surat even flew Dutch flags on his own ships to avoid the embargo, but it was only when the Dutch forcibly colonized much of Indonesia that Gujarati Muslims finally lost their grip on Malacca. But by then, new opportunities were already emerging on the horizon. As the Mughal juggernaut began to shake and unravel in the 18th century, the old order of great merchant princes and dynasties started to fall apart. Surat, which was repeatedly raided by the Maratha king Shivaji, faced growing competition from the East India Company's new port at Bombay. Now, three Gujarati Muslim communities, the Bohras, Memuns, and Khojas, who had hitherto been relatively small-time traders, found themselves ideally placed to benefit from the changing political landscape. Zohran Mamdani descends from the last of these. In his seminal book No Birds of Passage, A History of Gujarati Muslim Business Communities, 1800 to 1975, historian Michael O'Sullivan notes that these three groups had spread, and I quote, as far east as Ujjain, as far west as Karachi, as far south as Pune, and as far north as Udaipur. They thus inhabited a territory that was, by the reckoning of an Indian lexicographer in the 1840s, larger than Great Britain and Ireland, with their shared mother tongue, which was Gujarati, serving as the principal language of business in central and western India. End quote. Now, the Bohras, Memons, and Khojas had all converted to Islam around the 15th century, but their social and cultural practices were quite different. Subgroups were affiliated with various Sunni and Shia sects, some were Ismaili and revered the Aga Khans, while others traced descent by region and worshipped Sufi saints. Now, what these groups did share was the Jamaat, which was an institution that O'Sullivan describes as a form of corporate Islam. Essentially, members of each Jamaat shared some resources in common, like schools, hospitals, that sort of thing. But particularly wealthy members who often held senior religious positions also maintained private family trusts and companies. Now, what the Jamaat ensured, according to O'Sullivan, was a mechanism for organization, exclusivity, and interpretation, allowing these communities to adapt to the changing contours of Islamic practice to an era of globalization. Jamaats could mobilize capital, human resources, and theological flexibility at a rate that few other Indian institutions could match at the time. Now, collectively, these Gujarati Muslim Jamaats emerged as some of the most powerful Indian economic forces of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Though now they're outshone in the popular imagination by Parsi and Banya entrepreneurs, Gujarati Muslims similarly negotiated with the Marathas and the British, they benefited from the Opium Wars, and they switched soon after to manufacturing all sorts of commercial goods, especially in Bombay. In the 1840s, Gujarati Muslims commissioned pioneering printed texts in Gujarati, including travelogues and cultural primers for new markets like China. Their growing wealth also funded spectacular mansions such as those at Sidhpur, which are now eerily abandoned. But it was Gujarati Muslims, perhaps more than any other Indian group, who built the financial infrastructure of the British Raj in East Africa, a migration line from which Zohran Mamdani himself descends. Now, all of this led to a decisive shift in the center of gravity of Indian Ocean Islam. It was for this reason that the Aga Khan, who was revered by Ismaili Khojas, moved his seat from Iran to Bombay before partition. The versions of Islam promoted by Gujarati Muslims absorbed the modernist vocabulary of capital accumulation and inheritance, frequently splintering into new Jamaats as they expanded into ever new markets and cultures. At the same time, as researcher Danish Khan notes, Gujarati Muslims attained positions of leadership and influence in Bombay well before they had even set foot in the United States of America. I quote, "The first Muslim baronet in colonial India was a Khoja, and the first Muslim Indian civil service officer was a Sulaimani Bohra. Badruddin Tyabji and Rahimtullah Saini were the first two Muslim presidents of the Congress Party, and Sir Adamji Peerbhoy presided over the first session of the Muslim League in Karachi." But with the rise of pan-Islamic and Hindu nationalism in the early 20th century, the scales swung once again, and mercantile oceanic histories were overridden by grievances inspired by long-dead inland kings. So, where does the history of Gujarati Muslims fit now? Mamdani's election is a bit ironic on many levels, especially watching here from India. In Bombay, which was once the historic home of the community, a BJP politician declared in response to Mamdani's victory in New York that, and I quote, "We won't allow any Khan to become mayor." Now, the fact is that before and since, the history of Gujarati Muslims has, for all intents and purposes, disappeared in the ever-widening gap between radical Hindutva and radical Islam. Every news cycle, it seems, tears India's many intertwined histories further and further apart. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirbuddha and on Twitter at Ekaniseti. We'll see you next week.